Hey, Dr. Greg, thank you so much for joining us on Desert Streaming. It's really an honor to have you with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is a real honor and a real pleasure to be here with you.
Hey, I love what you're doing with the Catholic Psych Institute, and I was super thrilled to get you on the show just to talk a little bit about what got you into the ethos of St. John Paul II, and how have you been able to integrate that with your own psychological endeavors and offering on-ramps to people?
Yeah, I guess that's a good place to start. I think that a lot of times in our faith, people who grow up Catholic or who sort of think about how to be Catholic, it's really easy to disintegrate our faith from our sort of lived daily experience.
Mm.
And in my world, when I was growing up, we were nominally Catholic. We were Catholic, but sort of an uncatechized kind of approach where it was cultural and traditional, but didn't really have that depth of experience of living. And long story short, my parents, doing the best they could, eventually though got divorced, and I felt like my core was ripped open. It was my senior year of high school, and I was just about to go off to college, just trying to figure out who I am. And then this rug gets pulled out from underneath me. And, I was raised in an Italian Catholic family. That family was everything. And so, to split apart the family like that was really disorienting, to say the least. And then when I got to college, somebody gave me Love and Responsibility to read, with that philosophical work by John Paul II.
Just some light reading, right?
Yeah, some light reading, exactly. But you're a freshman in college. Actually, I was at Boston College, and I had Peter Kraft.
Oh, wow.
As a philosopher.
What a great guide.
Yeah. Awesome. So it's like, he's going to hit hard. He's not pulling punches, but by reading John Paul II, it did two things. It sort of answered why my heart was so hurt and why I felt so destroyed and disintegrated by divorce. And meanwhile, like, the culture was saying, like, oh, divorce is better for kids than, listening to parents arguing, and, everybody finds their own way and they'll figure it out and all this stuff. It's like, that's not how I felt. I felt like it was pretty terrible. And I read Love and Responsibility. It's like, oh, that's why. Like, now I see the vision and the beauty and the goodness of marriage. And I see why it's till death do us part. And I see why it's like the full package. And it's got to be like, faithful and fruitful and total, and, like the whole theology of the body paradigm. But it also did the second thing for me, where I realized this is one example of how a Catholic understanding of things makes my life make more sense. But it's deeper than that. It's like our whole life will make more sense if we actually look through this Catholic lens. And so it's meant to be a paradigm to live life by, not just like, what do you do on Sunday? What do you do? What are the rules for fasting during Lent? Like, I have to go to confession. It's like, not just about rules. It's just, it's like, how do I actually think about my place on this planet? And every day, every breath I take, every person I encounter, everything I think about doing with my life, it all makes more sense through the lens of faith. And John Paul II opened that up for me, and specifically his approach to talking and teaching the faith really makes it an experiential paradigm. Mm. And so that's where I started. And then, from there, I just built everything else on that.
Yeah, it sounds, thanks for sharing that. I think it sounds to me that John Paul II, especially through Love and Responsibility, this sort of first entree into John Paul II's teaching, had this kind of healing effect to you. It was almost a healing balm. Maybe you can speak a little bit more into that.
Yeah, once I realized there's a reason why I'm in so much pain, it became easier. It was healing. It's like the worst thing in the world to not be able to make sense of our suffering. And it's even worse when people are telling you you're supposed to get over it, or this shouldn't be as bad as it is, or the culture is basically saying, everybody's supposed to be looking out for themselves, and parents, they've got to look out for number one, and if they can't do it anymore, then they can't do it anymore. They have to put your oxygen mask on first before you take care of the person next to you. Like, there's a place for understanding the importance of self-care and stewardship of self, but as a child of a family that's going through that, it just doesn't feel like that. And so when you find a way to make sense of the suffering, even though it doesn't take away the suffering, it actually does help alleviate a certain weight to the experience of that suffering. And that's exactly what happened. So it's like, yeah, now I know what to do with it. I know what to make sense, how to make sense of it. Also just growing, then you grow in your spiritual life and you realize, okay, well, God didn't erase suffering. God actually entered into suffering. And then, okay, now there's even more meaning we can make. It's not just like, why does this feel so bad? It's also, what can I do with it? Mm. And then I can bring my suffering to Christ and unite my suffering to Christ's suffering, and actually becomes redemptive. And there's hope on the other side of death itself. So now all of a sudden it gives reason to our hope, and it is that healing. It's a lightening of the burden. His yoke is easy. His burden is light. It's not that there's no yoke. It's not that there's no suffering, but it's going to be a lightening of it, and it's going to make it possible. And that ends up being a healing process as well. We do that a lot in therapy and psychology. When we're healing people's traumas, when we're healing people of these disorders, there's a big portion of that has to do with making meaning of this suffering and understanding it, not taking it away, but contextualizing it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I love how you use the language of healing. I do feel like we need to reclaim that language, especially in the therapeutic realm, but also just in discipleship itself. Like, there's something about coming near to this Jesus that the byproduct, or maybe even the essence of it, is to be healed and to be integrated where we're disintegrated. And so,
Sure.
Being able to step into that for a season or for a few seasons is so helpful. And you said something that I think I kind of want to ask a little bit, especially in regards to those who struggle with things like same-sex attraction or attraction issues, where it's like, how do I follow Jesus when I have these areas where they're kind of a bit of a stumbling block? And what I think John Paul II offers us is a bit of a compass or a roadmap into how to integrate and make peace with who I am as a man, who I am in relationship to other people, whether it be persons of the same sex or the opposite sex. Can you speak a little bit into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a more of a delicate area, an issue, because same-sex attraction is so complex, and we would like to have simple answers to make meaning of our suffering and to understand why we feel the way we do. There's a difference between expressing something in my story with a very clear break and a consequence. It's like my pain that I'm suffering because of divorce. And then, you can't really compare that to the complexity of the suffering, the difficulties, the challenges that come along with discovering within oneself same-sex attraction. So I do want to start off by saying that, because there's a sort of difference in quality of what that inner experience is. But John Paul II does provide a much deeper blueprint to understand ourselves. This is something I've talked a lot about on my podcast. I have a podcast called Being Human, the Being Human podcast. And I've been talking about John Paul II as a psychologist. And what I mean by that is, there's different kinds of psychology. So you could be, a clinical psychologist. You can be a kind of a research psychologist. But there's a long history of psychological theory and psychological theorists. And so there's the theory of psychology, and you could also say the philosophy of psychology. And I think that John Paul II is the most important philosophical psychologist that's ever existed, especially for our time anyway. And so he talks about who the person is psychologically, spiritually, and physically. So he talks about the body, the material body, and then he talks about our spiritual dimension of who we are. Like what's the blueprint of the spirit of the person? And then the overlap between the body and the spirit is the psyche. And why is it the overlap? It's because it includes part of the person that's physical. So the brain, hormones, the different ways that the different parts of the body affect our brain and our psychological experience. And then it also includes the part of us that is open to transcendent truth. So we know through the faculty of the intellect, and we can think about what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. We are moved by beauty. Those kinds of things are happening on a spiritual level, but they're affecting us. Sometimes we can even feel it in our bodies. And so there's this overlap in the psyche. And the psyche is that realm of the overlap. So John Paul II mapped the whole thing out, which is really fascinating because it's a very deeply philosophical work. And you alluded to Love and Responsibility being light reading. Well, his full philosophical treatment of the human person is in a book called Person and Act. And it's like, it makes Love and Responsibility look like kindergarten coloring pages. So it's on another level.
Yeah, for sure.
And, only a few really dedicated nerds have spent, over 10 years, 15, 20 years studying this one book.
Yes.
To the depth at which it could be unpacked and translated into, different language. So
just a shout out to
Dr. I'm one of those nerds, by the way. I count myself in that company.
For sure. I also think of a Dr. Deborah Savage out at Steubenville. I know she's done wonderful work with Person and Act. So yeah, go ahead. But just shout outs to those.
Yeah, I was just at a conference with her. She invited me to, she hosted a conference at Steubenville, the Man and Woman Conference. And I was just there with her. So yeah, excellent. She's amazing.
She's wonderful.
There's a few of even, people that have been doing this for longer than I have, that have been, some people that I learned from, and it's amazing. I mean, you could spend your whole life studying the work of John Paul II and still just scratch the surface. And so, when we read that though, and we get that blueprint, we understand, okay, there's a way to make sense of, first of all, the primary foundation of the entire blueprint is that we are relational. And we lose a sense of this in psychology. People in psychology, we talk about our relationality as important, but we don't talk about it in psychology as fundamental, as core. And I would say that it's the most important core dimension of our humanity. And so, I've derived out of John Paul II's teaching 5 marks of relationship that are in the identity of the human person.
Okay. And would this kind of lay in the overlap here in the psyche? Is this kind of unpacking that overlap area?
Yeah. So this would all have psychological implication.
Okay.
And so we are made out of the Trinity. In God's image, we're made out of relationship. So God is a Trinity, and we are made out of the Trinity.
It's great.
In His image.
I love that. Okay, you're really blowing my mind with all this, Dr. Greg. This is great. So I'm totally tracking, but I just have to say to our listeners, like, pay attention. The language here is so rich. Like, we are made out of the Trinity. So yeah, just keep going. But I feel like that you're getting into some rich content that I think is worthy of just listening to and just chewing for a long time.
Yeah, I appreciate you pausing on that, because it's true. And we say this stuff, but we don't really, it's like too simple to really, to appreciate it first until we go deeper into it. And then we talk about being made in the image of God, and He's the Trinity. So Imago Dei. But like, what does that really mean? Like, if something is formed out of something else, or even in the image of something else, it's like the mark of that thing is in the thing that's created. So the relationality of God is not an accident. It's not a separate piece of God. It's not like a consideration of God. We're talking about the mystery of the Trinity. He is as much three as he is one. Mm-hmm. So we can't like skip that point. And so we're made out of that and in his image. And then we are formed in relationship. So in time and space, we're created, conceived within a family. And then we develop in space and time being formed in relationship. It's a significant mark of our actual being. Then third, we are wounded in relationship. So we are miseducated in the school of love. The school of love being the family. It's not always a perfect education. So we are miseducated in that relationship, and also by peers and friends and people who are aggressors in our life and people who have hurt us, and all of it. We're suffering from concupiscence in this world. The fourth mark of relationship for the person is that we are then healed in relationship. It's relationship that also heals us. And this is the fundamental importance for our model for psychology. And then the fifth dimension is that we are made for and destined for eternal union with God in relationship. So we're made out of God to be returned to God. Wow. And then we are formed and healed in that relationship. Formed, wounded, and healed in that relationship also. So yeah, 5 marks of relationship. This all comes out of, this is like basic. There are parts of it that are Catholic. It's just basic Catholic anthropology, Catholic philosophy, right?
Yeah.
But then it's like John Paul II articulated these things in such an important way to show us how it practically matters for our life.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, take my story. Like, why does divorce hurt a kid? It's like, well, marriage is meant to be an image of God. It's the formation and foundation for part of our creation. Children learn who they are because of what they're made out of, literally their parents. Their parents are not part of their identity. I hold within my own identity a sense of being from mom and dad together. Yeah. And those two have split in real life. How does that not split my sense of identity in half?
For sure. It was it so much reminds me of the work that we do in Living Waters. Like, we so believe in that thesis of we're wounded through relationships. So it's through relationships that we come to wholeness. And we try to do this. We try to replicate this in our little microcosms of the church through these groups. And I'll just say a quick word. I want you to keep going, but what you've just said reminds me of chapter 10 in Living Waters. It's called Identifying Brokenness, Resuming the Journey. And we really like Joseph Nicolosi here at Desert Stream. His thinking has been so just pivotal in forming our curriculum. And he mentions a couple of things that go into all of these sort of identifiers of giving people handles of understanding the fractures in their story. And he mentions family of origin and temperament. How not only our families of origin, we're born into these families, these pivotal, seminal relationships that introduce us to the world, but we also have a temperament. We have a grid or a lens through which we are interpreting all of that's going on around us. So my brokenness may be slightly different in nuance than my brother's brokenness, even though we grew up in the same household. So the temperament being so interesting, but also important in understanding our own stories.
Yeah, 100%. And so those individual differences are important. If the individual nurturing differences, like birth order, becomes really important. And then, I love Nicolosi's work. I actually was a research assistant for Joe when I was in grad school.
Wow.
I worked for a year with him, helping organize some of his writing.
Wow.
So his stuff is really consistent. Conrad Bars has a lot of really great Catholic sort of perspective on this, and talking about healing the unaffirmed, and coming up with these this emotional deprivation disorder. So those are different ways in which we see that sort of articulated through some of the psychology. But again, John Paul II already laid the foundation.
Yeah, amazing.
That makes all of these other models make sense, even on a deeper level. It's not just that Nicolosi had a great theory. I mean, he did. but it flowed out of a much deeper core anthropology. And it makes sense to the extent that it is consistent with that deeper core philosophy. And same with, Conrad Bars. And honestly, same with any other psychologist, any other sort of secular model. Everybody has some capacity for seeing the truth of the human person.
Yeah.
But we have to then know how to measure against, like what to measure against. What's the standard by which we measure things against? And we need a philosophical core anthropology as a standard to measure against.
Yeah.
And so then we can understand, okay, what's good about all of these other maybe secular theories? Maybe they're ancient theories. I mean, the temperaments goes back to the ancients, right? So they didn't know Jesus, but they certainly knew the human person. So they can make sense of it too.
Yeah.
Like, and so what do we retain? What do we let go of? That's maybe not, maybe not these things are not based on blood.
Yeah.
They're not the humors the way, but it is part of the body. So we can take that into account. Okay. So that's where we can see, and we're not even talking, we didn't even get into gender yet. So this is just relationship as a core foundation. But then on top of that, we are all either a male version of a human or a female version of a human. And that has significant intrinsic core consequences to the experience of being human. And so, then that gets pulled into this. What is the Catholic anthropology about gender, about male and female or sex? And then what does that have to do with sexual development? What does that have to do with attraction? Where does attraction fit into the human development? And then where can things go off course from what would be according to, God's plan and the order of sexuality? And there's plenty of ways in which it can go off course. There's plenty of ways to understand that through this lens. And that does give us a roadmap about how to live well in the midst of having many kinds of experiences.
Yeah. What I really appreciate about the Catholic anthropology that you're getting into is that there is this basis. There's this sort of blueprint, but also a destiny in one. So there's an understanding of, okay, I know I'm made for this. I may be so caught up in the gap between where I am and where I hope to be in relationship to that blueprint. But what I'm hearing from you is such a hope. Like, no, this is the job of the church, including the therapeutic community, to help people kind of launch into that journey adventure of making peace with this grid in our bones, so to speak.
Yeah. Amen. 100%. That's also, I love John Paul II's imagery. He was very artistic, and he wrote plays and he wrote poetry. And he also, his words sometimes were super philosophical, but also very poetic. And he used to say, become who you are. And it's like, become who you are. But then he had an image of being an artist. And he wrote a play called Our God's Brother. And it was about an artist who, he started off as a famous artist, a true story. And then he became Brother Albert, who is now Saint Albert, as a Polish saint. And he talked about, he made this connection to sort of the creation of art and bringing something into life. And, you almost think about also being a sculptor. It's like if we are sculpting ourselves. And so we're bringing that vision that we have of the full final product into existence through the work of sculpting or through the work of painting. So then you can understand, become who you are. It means like, okay, we are sculpting literally ourselves in collaboration with God.
Yeah.
But we are becoming who God has created us to be. He already has in his mind, because he's the ultimate artist, the full version of who we are. And we have a name for that. We call it being a saint. And so the saint version of us already exists in the mind of God. It's the full completed work of art, the masterpiece completed and perfected. And we are in the process of co-sculpting who we are to become along that path. So we're working with some flawed material. The marble is not perfect. And the instruments, the tools maybe are not perfect. And every once in a while, there's a chip off in the wrong spot. We crack something, if something looks different than what. And the beauty is that God is the eternal divine artist who is able to he's able to make perfect out of everything imperfect.
Yeah.
So just when we think we chipped off a spot, the wrong place in the wrong spot, whatever, he comes back in, he says, we're going to refashion that into something that is part of the perfection of this final product. Wow. You think that was a mistake. I'm going to make it not a mistake. And so this is an incredible adventure.
Yeah.
But the caveat is that we always have to be giving ourselves back to God. And when we do, we put ourselves back in his hands. Sometimes we make mistakes. We go to confession. Sometimes we have wounds, imperfections that we're not even responsible for. We still put our trust in him, and he makes perfection out of our imperfectness. And that's the whole beautiful story of the resurrection.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like John Paul II had in his mind the fact that the incarnation elevates everything, so even psychology, the Lord assumed the human nature in every level. And so therefore what he assumed, he's come to redeem. And so even when you're speaking about our emotionality or our ability to be in relationship and all of those things, the incarnation elevates in a way.
Yes.
And so it gives us also a hope for a new level of integration, maybe better than most of us even think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why, a lot of times people think that to be faithful, to be virtuous, to be Catholic is to sort of reject our humanity. Like you're talking about our emotionality or even our attractions and desires. And when we get into same-sex attraction, especially, it's a little bit murky because we're not saying that there's a wholesale rejection of being attracted to somebody of the same sex. This gets really nuanced, but we have to look at the sort of deep integration of where, sexual attraction, there's sort of a threshold here that we're talking about. And especially with female same-sex attraction, we see this a lot more. But there's, it's a little bit easier for men to be more compartmentalized and crystallized into is this sexual attraction or is this, not? Whereas it gets a little murkier and there's a lot more of this sort of spectrum with female attraction in general. But at the end of the day, if you read Pope Benedict also is very much in continuity with John Paul II, and he wrote the encyclical
Deus Caritas Est.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I was thinking of the word eros, but eros is not in the title. But he talks about the eros and the agape of God as being these two forms of love that are perfectly, infinitely united in the divine. And that eros, that sort of that core, that source of what we call erotic love, is actually in God in an infinite perfection. And it's completely in line with and united with and totally consistent with agape, which is the total self-sacrificial love. So in our humanity, especially in broken humanity, it's how do those two things go together? That doesn't make any sense. And a lot of times people just get the eros part separated out and then, fully self-informed. I just want to take, I just want to absorb, I just want to experience, I just want for me. It's the opposite of agape. But eros actually is a drive outwards towards another. And it means to be propelled, to be motivated, to be drawn out. And if you think about what that means, that's beautiful. And that we need to actually elevate and accentuate that. Not reject it, but it gets elevated and accentuated in context within a framework in which there's also agape, in which there's also virtue, in which there's also people knowing the transcendental truth, goodness, and beauty of what it is to be human, which includes God's plan for our sexuality and the whole full sexual purpose of the person, what marriage is, what man and woman is, how procreation fits together, the unity of the body and the spirit. The personal project of love has to be something that's manifest physically in a very specific and particular way. And that's when it's unleashed to be the thing that makes us like God.
Yeah.
So, no, we are not rejecting, any of our emotionality, any of our desire, any of our humanity. And that's what Christ enters in. I mean, if you listen to the words of Christ, it's passionate. Passion is part of Christ. For Christ's passion, we pray in the Divine Mercy Chaplet. It's like, that's eros. So yeah, talking about elevating humanity through the incarnation, he's the one that gives us the blueprint for how to be human. And it was not passionless. It was passionate. And he had all the emotions that we have.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he had them perfectly balanced within the framework of also what is true, good, and beautiful.
Yeah. No, that's so good, because I feel like there is a tendency for those of us who come out of SSA backgrounds and maybe just even sexual addiction in general to be slightly Gnostic, like, oh, my sexuality is a lot more of a liability than a blessing.
Right.
So I'm just going to sort of suppress it and be like hyper spiritual. Like, I'm going to be a really holy person who doesn't think about sexual things, but only thinks about spiritual things as a way of resolving, quote unquote, my same sex attraction. But in fact, that's equally unchaste just because we need to integrate all of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So we have to do a better job, I think, as a church. And I know you guys are doing an amazing job at this. And we're doing our part. We're trying, but we do have to do a better job as a whole in the church of showing this integrated path.
Yeah.
And really helping people understand like the full, this oft quoted, Gaudium et Spes 22, Christ reveals man to himself and makes his divine calling clear. Christ reveals man to himself. He's the mirror in which we can see how we are supposed to look and who we're supposed to become. But we have to really go all the way with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
exactly.
really see Christ in his fullness so that we can understand what we're made for, what we're capable of.
Yeah, I got one more question for you, Dr. Gray. This has been great. And I'm going to link in the show notes just how people can get to your podcast and your website. You also got great written stuff. Like when things come out, like for example, Fiducia Supplicans, you had a great response, both written and video form. I'm just going to highly suggest and link all of those things. I think they're really poignant and incisive the way you think. But last word is to those young Catholics who are therapists and who are really afraid to apply some of these Catholic anthropological truths in their practices because they feel like it's heavy-handed, or they may sort of veer into the conversion therapy camp, or whatever the case might be. There's a fear of really applying Catholic anthropology as the compass. What would you say to these people who are saying, I want to be faithful, but I need courage?
I would say this. I would say that the secular psychological landscape is pretty much a wasteland. And it's a wasteland of a landscape, and it's so deprived of truth. And in that space, there are truths being told and studied that do line up with truth. I'm not saying it's all evil, but it's like, stumbling along in a wasteland, and every once in a while you find like, a fruit tree or something, or every once in a while you find an oasis with some water. The world needs Catholic therapists who really are like fully understanding the anthropology and how to integrate it with the world of psychology. And it can be too easy because once you jump through all these ridiculous hoops, there's so much that goes along with being a mental health professional that I think is in some ways probably just trying to make up for a sense of actually not knowing what they're doing. So it's like, all right, well, we don't really know what we're doing, but as long as you have 5,000 hours of supervised practice signed off on, we're checking our boxes. We're following our ethics code. It's like, there's probably more to say about that. But once you do that and go through your 5,000 hours, 10,000 hours, whatever it is, you're like, all right, I'm done with schooling. Like, let me just get out into the world and practice. And the fact is, there's so much more that's necessary to be a representative of a Catholic approach to what Catholic therapy should be. So don't be afraid. First of all, if you're afraid of bringing the faith into the practice, don't. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the illusion and the superficiality of it's really like the Wizard of Oz. You know, it's like if you pull back the curtain, like what's really going on at the APA, what's really going on with these state mandates, it's like this short little fat wizard, you know, fake behind a curtain. Yes. And there's nothing to be afraid of there. However, we are entering into sacred ground when it comes to people's interiorities and people's wounds. And I would say be more afraid with fear and trembling of walking into that sacred ground duly prepared. Like, put in the extra time, go to the classes, take the courses, read the books, do the studies, sign up for the supervision, get the extra help, and then be bold and go where nobody else is going. You know, like JP2 would say, be not afraid. Don't be afraid to go out into the marketplaces, into the square, into the public square. Don't be afraid, but be formed. Be formed and then be unafraid. Yeah. So that would be my advice to young people right now.
Yeah. And do you have some resources that are helpful for people to be formed? Like, are there some good Catholic, you know, institutions that do this type of work, this type of formation?
Well, so honestly, we started a certification program for this very fact. So we have training that we're giving to people. It's a pretty intense 2-year program. And we combine Catholic anthropology, the philosophy of our faith, with the spirituality of our tradition, and also the psychology that is most relevant and most applicable to this perspective. But we also have a blog, we have a podcast, we have like shorter courses. I've got a bunch of little books I've written. So obviously not everybody should start off with the certification, but definitely get to know the kind of work that we're doing. Our mission at Catholic Psych Institute is to create a standard of mental health. And it's coming out of a Catholic worldview. So we are proposing to the world a way to understand mental health for all humanity out of the richness of our Catholic faith. And that's what I believe is what the church should be doing on all fronts. When the world is going sideways and upside down, the church should be the beacon of light and hope in the middle that says, this is the way. And till now, there's not been one coherent, consistent Catholic approach for mental health that provides that path. Yeah. And that's where I feel like we need to really come together to do that. So that's our mission, and that's what I definitely invite anybody interested to look more deeply into what we're doing.
That's great. Yeah, so I'll definitely link that in the show notes as well. So any of our listeners, therapists or counselors, people who are looking for more formation in this area, please check out the Catholic Psych Institute. So Dr. Greg, thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you're doing for the church. What a longevity your mission has for generations to come. So thank you.
Please, God.
What a gift.
Pray for us.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly will.